Something enormous is happening right now, and most Americans are only getting half the story. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. That was the opening move. What came next is where this gets deeply consequential for every single person watching this. Iran's IRGC has now ordered residents in the UAE to evacuate ports, docks, and US military shelters. That is not a bluff. That is a military pre-strike warning, the kind a commander issues before releasing weapons. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has effectively dropped to near zero. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait, refusing to move. Think about what that actually means. 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply and roughly 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade flows through that single choke point. It is now functionally closed. Qatar's energy minister warned that if the war continues, Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports entirely and declare force majeure, which, in his words, will bring down economies of the world. California's gasoline prices have already crossed $5 per gallon, and this is day 15. Iran's newly appointed Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has declared that strikes on Israel and US military assets will continue unless every base hosting American forces in the region is closed. That is not a negotiating position. That is a war doctrine. Iran has simultaneously threatened that if its own ports and docks are targeted, every port across the region becomes a legitimate military objective. The structure of what's unfolding here is not chaos, it is escalation architecture. And the question you need to ask is not whether this gets worse. The question is, who actually benefits from a world where the Strait of Hormuz stays shut? Now, to understand the full weight of what is happening right now, you need to go back to how all of this actually started. Because the framing you're getting from mainstream media is already stripped of the most important context. This did not begin on February 28th. The groundwork for this conflict was being laid for months before the first bomb fell on Iranian soil, and if you understand that timeline, the current port evacuation warnings from the IRGC start to make perfect, calculated sense. As far back as January 2026, the United States was already carrying out its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying air, naval, and missile defense assets amid escalating tensions with Iran. The public was told it was about Iran's nuclear program, but the sequence of events tells a more layered story. On February 16th, the IRGC began live-fire naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz, a temporary closure of sections of the waterway that hadn't been seen since the 1980s. The following day, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei warned that US warships deployed to the Gulf could be sunk and that the strongest army in the world may receive a slap it cannot recover from. That was February 17th. 11 days later, he was dead. Think about what that means. Iran was signaling loudly that it understood what was coming, and what came was not a surgical limited strike. US forces have struck more than 5,000 targets in Iran since the operation began. 5,000. That is not a message. That is a campaign of destruction. Now here is where this becomes directly relevant to Americans sitting at home, watching prices climb at the gas pump. Within hours of the first strikes, the IRGC transmitted warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. Tanker traffic dropped first by approximately 70%, and then over 150 ships anchored outside the strait to avoid risks. Soon after, traffic dropped to about zero. Think about what zero means in that sentence. The Strait of Hormuz is not an optional trade route, it is the jugular vein of the global energy economy. About 15 million barrels of oil and roughly 80 million tons of LNG passed through the strait last year alone. And right now, as you're watching this, that waterway is functionally closed by Iranian military pressure. And this is the part the financial press is struggling to communicate honestly. On March 6th, Qatar's energy minister warned that if the war continues, other Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports entirely and declare force majeure, warning that this will bring down economies of the world. Qatar's energy minister is not an alarmist. He runs one of the most sophisticated LNG export operations on the planet. When he uses language like bring down economies, he is doing a precise professional calculation, not issuing rhetoric. He is describing what happens when the physical infrastructure of global energy trade ceases to function, and he said it plainly. Now let us talk about what the IRGC actually did on March 14th, because this is the direct trigger for the specific threat you see in the title of this video. Iran's IRGC declared that U.S. interests in the UAE, including ports, docks, and military locations, are legitimate targets after U.S. forces attacked Iranian islands. In their statement, the IRGC explicitly urged residents in the UAE to evacuate ports, docks, and U.S. military shelters to avoid civilian casualties. That is the evacuation order. Notice what it actually is. It is not a random outburst. It follows a direct U.S. strike on Iranian islands in the Gulf. Iran hits back, then formally warns civilians to leave specific zones before the next wave comes. That is structured military communication. That is how a command issues intent before executing an operation. The evacuation notice is the prelude. Iran's armed forces around the same period made their position on ports explicit. If our ports and docks are threatened, all ports and docks in the region will be our legitimate targets. This came after the US military itself warned Iranians that it considers civilian ports in the Strait of Hormuz to be legitimate military targets, citing their alleged use for Iranian military operations. So you have both sides now formally designating each other's port infrastructure as fair game. That is an extraordinary moment. The world's most critical energy shipping corridor is now a declared war zone on both sides of the equation, and the global economy is held hostage in the middle. Let us be precise about the scale of Iran's assault on regional infrastructure so far, because the numbers are staggering and they are rarely presented in aggregate. Between March 7th and 8th alone, Iran launched drones and missiles targeting energy infrastructure, airports, military bases, government buildings, and urban areas in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. As of March 8th, the UAE alone reported that 1 to 422 drones and 246 missiles had been launched toward its territory. Think about that number for a moment. One country, 1,422 drones in under 2 weeks. Air defenses intercepted 342 drones and 229 missiles, which means roughly 80 drones and 17 missiles actually got through. Every one of those that penetrated is a real event with real consequences on real infrastructure. The IRGC has specifically targeted the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters at Mina Salman Port in Bahrain, as well as Camp Patriot in Kuwait, including equipment hangars, accommodation, and assembly centers for American soldiers at the Mohammed Al-Ahmad and Ali Al-Salem naval bases and Camp Buehring in Kuwait. These are not symbolic strikes, these are direct assaults on the architecture of American military power in the region. The US military has confirmed 11 fatalities from Iranian attacks across the region, and on March 13th, 4 out of 6 crew members were killed when a US refueling aircraft crashed in western Iraq. 11 American service members are dead. That fact is being reported, but it is not being given the weight it deserves in the national conversation. Now, here is where we have to talk about the leadership crisis inside Iran, because this is a dimension of this conflict that most Western commentary completely misses, and it matters enormously for understanding what happens next. When the US and Israel killed Ali Khamenei on February 28th, they didn't just remove a person, they removed the central node of authority in a system where all significant military and political decisions flow through one figure. What replaced him is contested, fractured, and in some ways more dangerous. Iran's newly appointed supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has issued his first statement warning that attacks on Israel and US military assets will continue unless every base hosting US forces in the region is closed. That is not a negotiating position with room to maneuver. That is a maximalist demand designed to be rejected, which means the strikes continue. But here is the split that makes this genuinely unpredictable. Iranian President Pezeshkian apologized to neighboring Gulf states for the strikes, stating that Tehran would suspend them, attributing the attacks to miscommunication in the ranks. Shortly after, however, Iran fired rockets again at Gulf targets. That sequence, a presidential apology followed immediately by more strikes, is not a contradiction. It is a power struggle displayed in public. The civilian government is saying one thing. The IRGC is doing another. Iran has both recognized the damage being done to its already tense relations with neighboring states while continuing on the same path. That is the behavior of an institution in internal conflict, where different power centers are making incompatible decisions simultaneously. And when you have that kind of fracture inside a military apparatus that controls thousands of drones and ballistic missiles, the risk of miscalculation becomes very, very real. On March 11th, the Unified Command Headquarters of the Iranian Armed Forces declared that US and Israel-linked economic centers and banks will now be targeted, warning that people in the region should not be within 1 kilometer of banks. IRGC-affiliated media released a list of companies targeted, which included Google, Microsoft, Palantir, IBM, Nvidia, and Oracle. Read that list carefully. These are not military targets. These are the pillars of the American technology and financial complex. When Iran starts naming Silicon Valley firms and global banks as legitimate military objectives, it is signaling a doctrine of economic warfare that extends far beyond the battlefield geography of the Gulf. It is telling you that this conflict has ambitions that reach into the architecture of the global economy itself. Iran's attacks, specifically targeting radars and missile defense equipment in the Gulf, have damaged a terminal high-altitude area defense radar in the UAE. This matters more than most people realize. THAAD is not just a missile shield, it is the premium layer of the American air defense architecture in the region. Degrading it, even partially, changes the calculus for what Iran can credibly threaten to hit next. Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf claimed that Iranian strikes on US radar and air defense systems now allow Iran to strike any target with fewer missiles. Whether that claim is fully accurate or partially inflated, the underlying message is being telegraphed deliberately. The cost of the next wave of strikes is going down. By March 9th, shipping insurance rates for the Strait of Hormuz had increased by 4 to 6 times over the previous week, and the US government began offering help to insurers under the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. The US government invoking terrorism risk insurance for a major international shipping corridor is not a routine administrative action. That is a government stepping in to backstop a market that private capital has functionally abandoned because the risk is no longer calculable. Trump announced that the US Navy will begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz if necessary, and that the US government would provide political risk insurance and guarantees for maritime trade, especially energy, traveling through the Gulf. When the most powerful navy in the world has to physically escort oil tankers through a waterway to prevent them from being sunk, you have left the world of normal geopolitics and entered something categorically different. The attacks also followed the failure of indirect negotiations in February on a new nuclear agreement with Iran. The mediating Omani foreign minister had stated significant progress, with Iran willing to make concessions, but President Trump said he was not thrilled with the talks. That one sentence deserves very slow reading. Iran was at the table. Iran was making concessions, and the United States walked away from the process. The bombs fell weeks later. Now 15 countries are dealing with missile strikes, oil infrastructure is burning, food prices are climbing globally, and 11 Americans are dead. All of this after Iran was reportedly willing to negotiate. Secretary of State Marco Rubio justified the operation by saying the US knew Israel was going to strike Iran, knew that would trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces, and therefore chose to launch preemptively to reduce US casualties. That logic is worth sitting with. The official justification for starting a war that has now drawn in at least 9 countries, shut down the world's most critical energy corridor, and produced over 1,400 dead in Iran, is that the US launched first to avoid higher casualties from a war it knew was coming anyway. It did not try to prevent the war. It tried to optimize its position within it. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution calling for Iran to immediately halt its attacks on Gulf states, with China and Russia abstaining rather than vetoing, allowing it to pass. The fact that China and Russia abstained rather than blocked this is significant. It tells you that even Iran's closest geopolitical partners are not prepared to formally shield it from international censure at this stage. That isolation matters for how long Iran can sustain the current tempo of operations without diplomatic cover. But here is the structural reality that none of the official framing wants you to focus on. The port evacuation orders from the IRGC, which is what brought you to this video, are not the beginning of the escalation. They are the current edge of an escalation that has been building for 2 weeks, in which the foundational assumptions of Gulf security, American military dominance, free navigation through Hormuz, the reliability of Gulf energy exports, have all been put under simultaneous stress. The evacuation warning is Iran saying, the next phase is coming, and the next phase targets the physical infrastructure through which the global economy breathes.